What is up, everybody? My name is Sam Pratt. Welcome to Rough Drafts, the podcast where I go deep each week on specific topics in limited format. This week is going to be a Tarkir Dragonstorm kind of retrospective lessons learned episode. So this was my first podcasting set, and it was a good one. And I'm still kind of figuring out how I want to treat, kind of end of the format, beginning of the new format, preview episodes. I was looking at the lengths of time of each set, kind of how many weeks is this going to be the draft set, and Tarkir is 9. We should expect almost every format to be 8 to 9 weeks with 6 sets a year. Tarkir was 9, so it's on the longer side. Final Fantasy is actually only going to be out for 7 weeks before Edge of Eternity comes out in late July. So I'm not sure if I'm going to do a retrospective every format. It might depend on how many weeks it's legal. It might depend on if I feel like I have anything interesting to say at the end of a format. I'm just kind of flying by the seat of my pants for the first set, figuring out things as I go, which is fine. I'm enjoying it. But we're going to do the retrospective lessons learned kind of sunset show for Tarkir. And I just want to say that this is one of my favorite formats of all time. This is an all-timer for me. I think there's a decent amount of bias on my part because I was so invested in this format starting the podcast. I played a ton at the start. I was winning a lot at the start, which definitely helps. But I do think this format is great, personally. I think it was very successful at what it was attempting to achieve. And just for me, it lines up really nicely with the things that I value in a format. So the thing that I liked the most about this format was the drafts were so open-ended. Because of the nature of it being a 3-color set, usually the 2-color sets, when it's a guild set like Strixhaven or something on Ravnica, you get funneled into one of those 5-color pairs, and there's not a lot of wiggle room to, build a 3-color deck that bridges 2 of them, etc. But in a 3-color set, there's inherently a lot more going on in terms of if you're in Teamer, are you going to be blue-red? Are you going to be green-red? Are you going to be green-blue? There's a lot more crossplay between the wedges or shards, and there's also a lot of differences within each clan, wedge, shard, whatever you're calling it. So because of that, I felt like the drafts were extremely open-ended. So even if you opened a bomb, say you opened Roar of the Endless Song, there was a lot of optionality between, are you going to be green-red, green-blue? You could go into 5-color. You could even end up in blue-red. I had a draft recently where I opened Eshki, which is a card that usually I play in blue-green, but I ended up in blue-red splashing Eshki, and it was interesting to try to find cheap creatures to pick up to trigger it alongside my more expensive non-creature spells, etc. There were so many different paths you could go down, and I felt like this format really rewarded deep format knowledge. Which benefited me because I started the podcast at the beginning of the format, and I was kind of contractually obliged to go deep on it and really think hard about it and try to analyze all of these different strategies from the get-go. So I felt like this format really rewarded knowing how to build 15 different decks, or maybe 10 different deck skeletons, which is so much more than how you would think this 3-color set would go, being there are 5 clan decks and that's it. There's such a sliding scale between am I a straight 2-color deck? Am I a 3-color deck? Am I a 5-color deck? If I'm a 3-color deck, what's my base? What's my game plan? I felt like this format really rewarded knowing your game plan, knowing if you're an aggressive deck, if you're a proactive mid-range deck, knowing how to build a control deck with no 2-drops, etc. My personal taste, I value open-ended drafts and interesting drafts. I think this format offered it in spades. The other praise of this format I will sing is that I think it was remarkably balanced for a 3-color set. Obviously, Abzan was a step behind everything else, though I had a lot of success with black-green. I had a lot of success with white-green, which is strictly an Abzan deck. So while Abzan was the worst, it definitely wasn't unplayable or anything. Boros was the best deck, white-red aggro, and I would say the 5-color Dragon Soup deck was the other best deck, which are 2 very diametrically opposed poles. But the Dragons deck was very hard to get into, kind of after week 2, week 3, once people started going insane and taking globes way too high. And the Boros deck was tough to beat, but later in the format, it got pretty contested, and the bad versions of Boros were really bad. Your average just mid-range deck would crush these kind of like weaker, like you were fighting over Boros with other people at the table. Those decks really did not end up panning out. So something I'll say that's a positive for this format was I never felt like I was punished for not accepting an open Boros seat. There were a lot of drafts where I would have like a shaky start, and then I would see like a late Shock Brigade or a late Sharpshooter, and I would jump into Boros and be really rewarded. But there were a lot of formats where I'd open, let's say again, Roar of the Endless Song. I would get past like pick 4, a Frontline Rush, but there was another good, like maybe a Sibsig Appraiser in the pack. I never felt like I was punished for refusing an open Boros lane. I was passing it to someone to my left, and there were enough like good open lanes that you could navigate into just because, you know, all of the commons are very flat thanks to play boosters. There was just like not many bad cards. All of the colors were fairly balanced. Like I never felt like I would get to the end of the draft and have a pretty good teamer deck and be like, well, I passed like the best Boros deck. I really regret that. I felt draft to draft like I had a menu of a couple different open decks I could have gotten into, and I was not disappointed when I passed the open best deck like I do in more imbalanced formats. Something like Aether Drift, which I thought was actually pretty balanced, like green self-corrected, but I often had regrets like passing green cards in pack 1 and then green ended up being super open later on. This format, like the stuff is all good enough that it feels good to forge your own lane and maybe give up a chance at drafting the best deck for a deck that you know you can build well with the cards you already have, and you have a shot with that deck that you draft. In a lot of more imbalanced formats, there's kind of this tension of wanting to draft the best deck, like the best deck in the format, the tier 1 deck, but not knowing if it's open. And I felt like that in Boros with this format. Like if there was tension of knowing like if I get a bad Boros deck, it's going to be really bad. But if it's open, I'm going to wish that I had drafted it. But there's enough open lanes. Like there are enough individual decks, like unique decks, unique game plans, and enough of that open in each seat that I never felt like I was really punished for passing up the Boros lane, which is something I really like in formats. When there's enough viable decks that you don't feel bad passing the best deck if your draft is like a safer navigation avoiding it, or if you have the opportunity to do something really creative. So I'll mention some negative points. The big one is there are so many busted mythics in this set. I will say one positive is they actually did a very, very good job of making the mythics the busted cards, not the rares. I think if you swap Taigam, which is a mythic, with Meringue River Regent, I think it's basically, there's like Roar of the Endless Song and stuff, but basically every mythic is busted and every rare is like pretty good. So they did a really good job at that, but there are too many good mythics. You know, I have a pretty high tolerance for bombs. I wish there were like 2 to 3 fewer cards, like having Ugin and Jeskai Revelation and Ureni Dragonback Assault all at Mythic was pretty overbearing and really set the tone for the format. You can build with bombs in mind in your game plan, but there were just a few too many. And I think because of that, the gameplay suffered a little bit. There was a higher than average percent of non-games on both ends. You know, you get curved out by Boros, you set up the sweet game plan, your opponent plays a Dragonback Assault, suddenly you lose. But overall, this format was extremely successful at what it was trying to do, which is like the spectrum of 2 to 5 colored decks are all viable. All of the clans felt distinct. And dragons were actively good. This is huge. Like we've never had a format like this where they tried really hard to make the big, expensive monsters like the best thing to be doing in the format. And the dragons were really good in the set, and that was really sweet. These factors of like it being very open in your seat, the full spectrum of 2 to 5 color, like the fixing is really good. That's not what everyone values in a format. So I don't think this is like a more universal all-timer. Like I would say like Kaldheim and Duskmourn apply to a very, very wide spectrum of people. I don't think this format is like this, but it applies so well to me. I love this format. I think it's great. I wouldn't change a thing. I think nerfing Boros or nerfing 5 colors has huge ramifications. Like if you nerf Boros, the 5 color decks get too good. If you nerf the 5 color decks, the aggro decks probably get too good. I think it's a great balance. I'd probably buff some Abzan cards. I had good success with green black and like black mid range, but overall, I think they were extremely successful. This is in my top 5, I think. It's always tricky to rank sets right when they're out because I always overrate them, but I think this is going to land in my top 5, just below like Kaldheim, Duskmourn, probably about the level of March the Machine, which I realize are all formats with a wide range of things to do below the top tier decks, which are usually like white aggro decks, and they all have great fixing. So I think those are 2 things that I value in a format. I think this really struck gold on both of those accounts, and yeah, I love this format. Into more strategic discussions instead of me just gushing about Tarkir. I'm going to talk about specific lessons that we have learned from Tarkir Dragonstorm. The first takeaway from Tarkir is that formats have indeed slowed down. About a year ago, maybe a little less, Maro had this blog post that I've referenced before where he talks about how they have changed the way they design sets in play boosters. And he said that they were starting to be intentional about trying to slow formats down. And that has definitely shown to be the case with this format, and the past couple formats. So like Duskmourn had a great aggro deck, like the white decks were very fast, but Foundations was a very slow format and Aether Drift was a very slow format. So they've really kind of taken the power away from cheap things that attack well, like reduced the number of 1-drops, reduced and depowered the 2-drops in every color. And you can really feel it in the last couple formats. Now, there's still really good aggro decks. This kind of brings up the question of what fast format and slow format actually mean. Like, Boros is extremely good in this format. There wasn't quite a great aggro deck in Aether Drift, maybe like Black-Red. And I think the interesting part about this format is they didn't really nerf aggro. Like, there's still a great Boros deck. But what they did was they gave power to the cheap interaction in the exhales. The format had a good aggro deck, but the format didn't feel fast. And I think feeling fast or slow is way more important than the actual like number of turns listed on like the 17 lands format speed page. So having good cheap interaction gives slower decks something powerful to do on the early turns, which I think is very important in letting slower decks thrive. Way more important than downplaying aggro decks, because I think aggro decks are very good for formats. Like this format definitely verges on the cusp of being way too soupy. If the Boros deck wasn't as good, like if they had nerfed like Mardu Devotee, Shock Brigade, etc., this format would have just been like Pile City. It would have been awful. Closer to what a lot of people didn't like about Aether Drift, where it was like just green mid-range mirrors, and Aether Drift had a lot more than that. But I think really powering up the cheap interaction really helps not necessarily like punish the aggro decks, but gives the slower decks something good to do early. So going forward, I'm on the lookout for that. If a format lacks good cheap interaction, which, spoiler alert, so far we haven't really seen much good cheap interaction from Final Fantasy. So this is something I have my eye on. Maybe we are back to the days of fast formats, cheap things that attack well are really good. That's something that I'm bringing towards the future, where if there is good interaction, then the slow decks can thrive. And kind of in a similar vein, the next lesson that I feel like we've learned from Tarkir is that play boosters are humming. In that design shift article, they really stressed that the common power level, they want the commons to be generically good and the uncommons to be like what you're building your deck around. And this is a pretty big shift from previous formats in previous years, where the top common really mattered. Like the best couple commons in the format were huge and you really felt bad passing them. In this format, I would say Sib-Sig Appraiser is probably the best common. I'm totally fine passing Sib-Sig Appraisers if it doesn't fit my plan. That's a really big shift from where we were a year or two ago. like, what was the best common for Aether Drift? Like, it's a number of things. Same with Foundation, same with Duskmourn, same with Bloomburrow. We haven't really had a tier 1 common, like an S tier common, since Writhing Chrysalis, which was a pretty big outlier. And then like Novice Inspector and Murders, which was the first play booster set. So things have really shifted towards the draft formats being defined by uncommons and rares, which I think personally is a great change. I think it's way more interesting when your drafts revolve around the more powerful cards like uncommons than they do like the generic power outlier commons, like something like Inspiring Overseer, Organ Hoarder, even just like, oh, this is the best common removal spell, you have to take it. Like I passed Molten Exhales to take a card that's on plan and like about the same power level but works specifically well for my deck. I think that leads to way more interesting drafts, and I think that's something we've seen over the last couple play booster sets be really successful. The next lesson learned, we are in the golden age of the manalith. Obviously, this format, Dragonstorm Globe, was a top common. I think people still overrated it, but it was very, very good. And last format, we had Starting Column, which I don't know if everyone would accept that as a top common, but it was great. It really tied together a lot of interesting strategies in Aether Drift. And I think people forget that in 2024, we actually had a whole slew of good manaliths too. Outlaws had Bandits Hall, which was a key piece of the Crimes control deck. Bloomburrow had Patchwork Banner, which was just a top uncommon. And Foundations even had Heraldic Banner, which was like a monocolor manalith, but was an actively good card in that format. So I think with the powering down of aggro decks, with the kind of shift towards slower formats, more mana is more power. And anytime we get a manalith with a decent amount of upside like we have over the past year, I really have my eye on that going forward. One Tarkir specific lesson that was really interesting to figure out was realizing that the fixing from spells was more valuable than the fixing from lands. So like basically the devotees were really important and the monuments were very, very good. And Dragonstorm Globe was great. Now I say this is Tarkir specific because I'm not sure if this was just because the lands were extremely abundant. Like we had so much land fixing that the non-land fixing was especially valuable. But I did just mention that manaliths have been getting better over the past year. So this might be something going forward to keep an eye on. Like, is non-land fixing just better than land fixing? I don't know. We'll have to keep that in mind going forward as well. A couple of individual card designs that I want to point out that give me things to think about for future formats. Coordinated Maneuver, the kind of archetype of white removal spell that's pretty new, that's like deal damage to a creature equal to the number of creatures you control. This card was really good in the aggro decks in this format. We had a version of this in Aether Drift that I can't remember the name, but it was a sorcery and had the option to destroy an artifact, I think. That card was pretty bad in Aether Drift. And I think when we see these going forward, they need to be instants. I think these play better in aggro decks, and I think having the optionality of doing this at instant speed, either on your opponent's turn or maybe mid-combat, is really important. We also saw Thraben Charm in MH3 be a top common as well. One other common thing between these three spells is that they all are modal. We have a version of this spell in Final Fantasy with no alternate modes. It's just the deal damage, but it also counts your equipment because there's a huge equipment living weapon theme in Final Fantasy. This spell is an instant, but it'll be interesting to see. Instant speed is definitely valuable for these spells, but how valuable is it to have multiple modes on this type of spell? So it's definitely something I'm keeping my eye on. In a similar vein, another removal spell at common in Tarkir was Worthy Cost, and this card was awful in this format. I think Bone Splinter variants, the kind of sack a creature, kill a creature, those get overrated basically every single time. I think the big outlier was Final Vengeance in Duskmourn, but that one was so good because sacking a room was just so free if you built your deck well, and it exiled. So I think the sack mode on the Bone Splinters variants either needs to be extremely free, like maybe you can sack like an artifact or something. We might have that card in Final Fantasy, I'll have to check. Or it needs to have a buyout mode like Eaten Alive, which was a pretty good spell in Foundations. The last individual card I want to take note of is Sunset Strikemaster. This is the first time I'm pretty sure that Red has gotten a straight up mana dork in like a modern set. This card was really good. There was a designer, I can't remember who it is, that said that this is something they're planning on doing moving forward, is giving Red a little bit of mana acceleration in the form of like a mana dork. Sunset Strikemaster being really good has my eye on any future Red mana dorks. Like maybe that sort of thing is just really valuable for Red decks in general in every format. So I loved Strikemaster, and I'm pretty excited to see the designs of these Red mana dorks going forward. And that's kind of all the strategic takeaways that I have for this format. I want to also note that this is not strategic in any way. This is not strategic advice. This set was really popular. It massively outsold their expectations. I think part of that is because dragons are sweet. People love dragons. But I think Magic players have a deep fondness for Tarkir because it's one of the last old era planes. Like, Tarkir came out in 2014, and then the next sets were like Kaladesh and Return to Battle for Zendikar. And then beyond, they kind of like pulled back on the number of new worlds they were creating. It was the last 3-set block. Tarkir was kind of the end of an era of Magic, and it's so in stark contrast to the hat sets we've gotten. So like Murders and Aetherdrift, which were both really unpopular, and very in contrast to Universes Beyond. Like this feels like a Magic set designed for Magic players. And I think the popularity shows that Magic players have kind of been starving for that kind of set over the past like year, 2 years, you know, with all the like Duskmourn was a very original plane, but it had all this like Ghostbusters vibe. People hated Aetherdrift, etc. So I'm hoping that kind of steers the course. Maybe we cut back on one Universes Beyond set per year. I think that's pretty unlikely to happen, but you know, ultimately I'm in it for playing limited, so it doesn't really matter. I hope this episode was interesting to you. Like I said, I'm kind of making things up as I go in terms of my content schedule, like how I'm treating end of formats, beginning of formats. So if you enjoyed this show, I'd love to hear feedback on this kind of type of content, like the Sunset show. I'm not sure how I'm going to handle a Final Fantasy preview show next week. I'm going to think up things. If you have anything that you would suggest for me, please let me know. You can find me on Blue Sky at sampratt.bsky.social. You can find me on Discord at samp6. And I stream occasionally on Twitch, usually Thursday evenings at samp_mtg. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.